Now we are recording and we are live.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Eris. My name is Dr. Cheryl Jimenez-Fry. I am the chair of this panel. We're talking about archival silences today. In this panel, all of us are doing work with the Journal of the Plague Year Archive Project, a global archiving project that started at Arizona State University, but now includes partners all over the world, including myself and my colleagues at University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire, who will be presenting on our project documenting the stories of undocumented immigrants and others in rural areas in rural Wisconsin where we are. And Reverend Shonda Nicole Gladden is with us too. She's going to be presenting her project from Indiana-Purdue University, and Emily Learson as well. She's going to be doing talking about her project at Indiana-Purdue as well. So we will get started then. Actually, I think that we can kick off with our project that is a little bit more unconventional in terms of a panel presentation that we're going to start off with, because myself, Dr. Lisa Schiller, Dr. Elena Casey, and Dr. Lorraine Smith, we are working on a cross-disciplinary project where I myself am in history. I teach public history and Latin American history classes here at UW-Eau Claire. Dr. Casey teaches Spanish courses, and Lorraine, Dr. Smith and Dr. Schiller both teach nursing here. So we have a really interesting multidisciplinary collaboration that we're going to talk about that contributes to the Journal of the Plague Year and our regional archive project, where we're documenting rural voices, essentially, in rural Wisconsin. So let me share my PowerPoint here real quick. And I think what we're going to do, because our presentation is a little bit maybe more unconventional, because there's several members of us and we're talking about, we have a project where we all play a role, and it involves our students too. So we've come up with this great project and we want to focus on how the students are helping us do this work too. But I'm going to start out thinking about how the project started and pass it over to Dr. Schiller and Smith to talk about the nursing component, and Dr. Casey will finish off thinking about the interview aspect. So essentially this project, we began thinking about this project, calling it Documenting the Undocumented. We wanted to, it's all about documenting the experiences of marginalized communities in Western Wisconsin that quite often aren't heard. So how did we even get here? Is essentially this project, like a lot of other projects that are being presented at NCPH this year, began as a rapid response collection project in response to the pandemic. We all know, right? Everything changed last March. And so this image shows my class. I was teaching a public history course at the time. And my public history students, they were working on an exhibit. They were doing field work, as you often do in public history courses, and they were designing an exhibit for a local welcome center. That couldn't happen after we went online. I had to sort of figure out, what do I do? How can these students still be getting field experience and understanding the work of public historians? So I said, hey, what do you think if we just dropped everything and started an archive? And to their great credit, all of these students said, absolutely, let's do it. And so in the vein of rapid response collection projects that I think a lot of the audience at NCPH is very familiar with, and I know everybody on our panel is, of course, documenting history as it's happening. So these students and I, we came together with our archivist and librarian at our special collections at UWEC and created an archive project, and we called it the Chippewa Valley COVID-19 Archive. So we began to document, digital artifacts, ephemera, things that document experiences of the pandemic, particularly for our area of Wisconsin, which is Western Wisconsin, a little bit more rural. It's not Madison and Milwaukee who had their own projects, right? So we really wanted to document what is COVID-19 like more in rural areas. And this led to oral history interviews. My students and I began working with Jason Kelly, Dr. Jason Kelly at Indiana-Purdue, and we started doing oral histories of the pandemic, and this kind of became very central to the project. And we began working with Journal of the Plague Year then. And so it began as a regional archive, spread to the Journal of the Plague Year, and this really great collaboration of scholars across the world, which all of us on this panel today are doing, contributing to these voices and understandings of the pandemic. How did this play out for people in different parts of the world? So our place in all of this is the rural voices part. And so with the plague year, with the Journal of the Plague Year, we started contributing to a collection called Rural Voices. And thinking about documenting those voices, with my students last year, we, like a lot of public historians, started to question the silences. Is what are we missing in this? Is that what voices are harder to get? And we want a representative archive. We want a diverse archive. And how do we get those voices? And so that brings us to our particular project with nursing and Spanish and history all together, is that I know, when people think of Wisconsin, they think of America's dairyland for good reason. Dairy is a big part of the state industry. It's $1 billion generator. It is part of identity, essentially, in Wisconsin. It's so much a part of the state's history and its main business. But most people don't think of Latinx immigrants when they think the dairy industry and the Midwest. But that is actually not correct, is that the labor behind the industry for quite some time has had strong links to Tejano migrant workers, to Latinx workers from areas of Mexico and Central America. And so especially during World War II, this kind of amped up when there's a labor shortage and the government under the Bracero program, asked workers to come and work in different areas of the United States. One of those was Wisconsin. So here's some images from the 1950s. This continued. And so the workers have never gone away. There's been that strong connection, and it's grown over time. Immigrant workers, these are just a few headlines, became the backbone of Wisconsin's dairy business. The signature industry, right, of our state, really embedded in identity in Wisconsin as the home of dairy. Behind it is immigrant workers. And so with the project, we began thinking, how can we document these voices? These are incredibly important. They are integral to our communities, to business in the state. And how do we access those voices? So with oral histories, I think we all are familiar that, trust is important. So how do we build trust with marginalized communities and get those voices? Especially when those voices are more at risk. We understood that not only are their stories important because they are an integral part of our communities and they have so much to share and so much to teach us, and it's important for future researchers and policymakers and students to have access to these experiences, but they're also more at risk for COVID-19. So for various reasons, crowded housing conditions, quite often working conditions. I mean, they can't just work from home like us. So there are many things that go into this, that we realized this needed to be a centerpiece of our archive project and thinking about how to document rural voices. So this is where the project came about. And I'll pass it over to Lisa and Lorraine actually now, and you can tell us a little bit about the nursing element of this. It's, I mentioned that trust was very important. When I began thinking about this project, I myself was a new faculty member here. I had only been at UWEC for about a year. And so hadn't established connections with the local Latinx community. Why would they trust me? How can I get these experiences that are so important? And that's actually where nursing comes in, is that we were able to collaborate with nursing faculty and then begin with Spanish faculty to have this collaboration between my students in public history, students who are enrolled in Spanish courses, and Latin American and Latinx studies students, and nursing. So I'm going to pass it over to Lisa actually, or Dr. Schiller, and you can tell us about the nursing component.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the program that we have, which is Compañeros en Salud y Seguridad, or Partners in Health and Safety. This is a program that's a collaboration of the university, public health departments in both Buffalo and Putnam County, a not-for-profit called Puentes, which I'll talk a little bit more about, Chippewa Valley Free Clinic, as well as dairy producers in Buffalo and Putnam County. You can go to the next slide. So when we look at our rural communities, what's really happening when we talked about this increase in Latinx labor, there's been an increase in production as well, which is accompanied by a decrease in the number of farms, but there's an increase in herd size, and farmers just really haven't been able to hire enough labor to be able to handle those increased herd sizes. So there's been a need for immigrant labor to fulfill labor needs. And in fact, in our counties here, there's been an increase, I mean, in just from 2000 to 2010 census, and we don't know what 2020 looks like, there was an increase in Hispanics by 175%. The other thing that's kind of unique about immigrant dairy workers is that there is a large amount of occupational risk. So there's risk working with large animals. And unlike many other industries, there is not OSHA to regulate it. So there's no way to enforce to decrease occupational hazards. And along with that, the home and the workplace are really often the same. There's high rates of uninsurance and underinsurance. And then of course, just with the lack of access to healthcare in rural areas. Next slide. So there's particular barriers to healthcare for Latinx immigrant workers. Again, we talked about the lack of insurance, the high cost of healthcare services. They're used to nationalized healthcare systems where they have a local health clinic. There's lack of access to preventative care, huge communication issues. And I'll add for communication, you know, not only is there a language barrier, many of our workers are, their first language is Nahuatl and Spanish is a second language. And then top that with the medical jargon that we use. So there's a lot of issues with communication. In addition, transportation is an issue. Many of these workers live in very rural areas. And in Wisconsin, if you are not documented, you cannot have a driver's license. There's a lot of differences in culture, and of course, that fear factor related to documentation status. Next slide. So what have we done? We've been, over the last 10 years, the project started in 2011, and every semester we bring senior nursing students that are in a community health and leadership clinical, and that's embedded in our curriculum, 2 area farms where we provide personal and occupational health screening and education. Includes things like influenza vaccination, tetanus vaccination, TB testing, cholesterol and glucose testing, as well as education about certain occupational risks, such as how to lift properly. The important thing is that we have brought the services to the farm. And any of you that are familiar with agriculture in general, the services come to the farm. If people want to sell things to the farmers, the salesman comes to the farm, the veterinarian comes to the farm. And over the past 10 years, we've seen over 500 unique individuals, and we've brought 100 senior nursing students through the program, which to us is important because nursing students see patients across the border. So in ER, public health, all those kind of things. We've established relationships with local health departments, along with producers and workers. We work with Puentes, which is the not-for-profit I mentioned before. And what Puentes does is goes to the farm, provides both English and Spanish language lessons, as well as provides interpretation services between farmers and workers. And in addition, once a year, they bring groups of farmers and community members to Veracruz and Puebla, Mexico, where we meet with individuals who had been working on farms or their farm families. So if you saw the first slide that Cheryl put up where it talks about our partnership, that top family there is actually that gentleman's family that we met. And the guy in the boy in the white shirt is now also a worker at one of our farms. So we have relationships not only with our workers, but with their families. Yeah, next slide. So partnership again includes the two counties, University of Wisconsin, Eau Claire, Puentes or Bridges, along with Chippewa Valley Free Clinic. And Chippewa Valley Free Clinic provides us with different over-the-counter medications that we can bring, but most importantly, they provide medical care, dental care, mental health care, and optical care, free of charge for those that don't have insurance. And so we're able to, if we screen and find something wrong, we're able to have a place for our workers to go. Next slide. So over the past 10 years, it looked like this. So we were doing our clinics in milk houses. You can see they're teaching some strengthening exercises for upper extremities and how to lift properly on the left. They're doing some influenza vaccines in farm workers' homes on the right. And then everything changed. And I will let Lorraine take over from here, my partner, Lorraine.
As you saw from the previous slide with Dr. Schiller, the students were inside and they were at a little bit closer quarters and weren't wearing their masks as we have to do now. Not only did our focus change from farm safety, health promotion to communicable disease management, we also had to be mindful of what was going on in the changing COVID scene. So in order to do this clinical, students needed to wear their N95 masks along with these lovely goggles, and we provided care out on decks so that we could do social distancing, at least between student groups that had different focus, whether it was teaching, screening, or giving injections. So in the fall, our focus was teaching about the immunization clinic in influenza, and our role in this project was to explain the project quickly and gather consent, written consent, and get the phone numbers and bring those back and connect with our other colleagues on when we could call our interviewees up. And so that was kind of the role, was the data collection. So we were a conduit to the interviewees by quickly gathering their information on how to contact them. Then we came to spring. And in spring, we had access to COVID-19 vaccinations. So our focus changed from influenza to COVID-19. We all are very much on a learning curve yet of everything that's going on with all the different kinds of vaccines. So it's important that we were able to quickly work with our colleagues on how to change the information or offer the information about COVID-19 vaccinations in Spanish to our workers and farm families. So we then had to also figure out a way that it was safe for the workers to get to where we were going to vaccinate them, because we couldn't do the vaccinations and manage it at all the various farms. So we went to the farmers and asked them, what site do you think would work? And would you be willing to bring your workers in to get the vaccine? So what we saw happen was the farmers coming with their workers and sitting side by side after getting their vaccinations. And last semester, when we limited contact to 15 minutes, we actually, this semester, were able to gain that time, because not only did we give the COVID vaccinations at a local church, but they had to wait 15 minutes after the vaccine, which made it an ideal time for our partners in this project to be actually able to approach them, gain consent, and do the interviews on site. So our additional community partner was a local Lutheran church, along with a County of Buffalo Health Department officer. And the neat thing was, when you looked out at the whole clinic, it was a whole community taking care of a community, and it was very heartwarming. Next slide. So what have our students learned from this experience? Here's some of their reflections. Participation in this clinical was unique in that it was interdisciplinary, hands-on, and multifaceted. This project encouraged me to participate in more educational opportunities outside of the classroom and textbooks. I feel gratified that from what comes out when you do good for others. And this student was looking forward to future volunteer experiences after he graduates. And the last one, I had not expected how the workers seemed to be just as nervous and excited as we were. Thinking back, it makes me sense why they might be nervous. And it also helped calm me down when we were both nervous together and working through it together. And lastly, if you go to the next slide, the final reflection was this. The resiliency and flexibility portrayed by the farmers have definitely impacted my worldview and value systems. Too often, I allow myself to feel incredibly overworked, overwhelmed, and blind to what is happening in the world around me. When I consider the sacrifices that the farmers have made to be here, separation from family, giving up legal security, leaving a less stressful job, I stop and admire their continued positive outlook and persistence to achieve what they have always been working towards. The close relationships that I see among the workers reminds me to consider those who surround me in this busy life and thank them for the valuable roles they play. Now I'll let Dr. Casey share some other student reflections and some lessons we all learned in this project.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. And actually, before I begin, I'd like to pause and ask our hosts if our technological concerns have been resolved, or if we need to pause at this point to fix those.
What happened? I'm not sure. Are we not?
Check the chat, Dr. Cheryl, check the chat.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, there's a tech issue on feed loop.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So I've let them know that we are, again, pausing for the moment until they're able to resolve that. And once they give us the go ahead, I'll continue with my segment of the presentation, shortened, obviously, to facilitate time for our ensuing.
Oh, no, I didn't even see that come up on the chat. Did that come up in the initial conversation when I was introducing everything?
No, it didn't come up until partway through Dr. Schiller and Smith presentation.
We can kind of pick up a little bit and sort of, I think you can make up for the lack there.
Are you communicating with people on feed loop on behalf of our session?
Let me see. No. I can do that though real quick.
Okay, just let me know when you have that set up, and then it sounds like we'll be good to go.
Now it says we should be good.
Perfect.
Oh,
We're good to
All
go.
right.
Yeah.
Well then, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for resolving that, Leilani. Okay, so I'm Dr. Casey, and like Dr. Schiller and Smith and Jimenez Fry said, that I am training our Spanish speaking in students to perform interviews in Spanish, and also when needed to interpret for our vaccine clinics, especially those students on the project with a healthcare background. We're fortunate enough for one of our interns to be both a nursing and Spanish student, which has helped tremendously. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what we've learned so far through our collaboration. And actually, you can see some of our lessons here on this slide, including, what we've learned about voice recording technologies. We've learned that, especially for our Spanish speaking interviewees, audio recording technologies, when those interviews have to be conducted by phone or from a distance, are overwhelmingly more successful than technologies like Zoom or Collaborate Ultra. All of our Spanish speaking interviewees wish to remain anonymous, and they trust those audio recorders such as Google Voice, or when we are able to be in person, digital audio recorders much more than Zoom. And actually, before we were able to switch over to audio recording technologies from our video streaming platforms, we had only attained one Spanish speaking interview despite around 20 interested Spanish speaking interviewees who were still in touch with our student interns indicating their interest, but it took switching over for them to feel confident to share their voices. And even as well, meeting in person has been tremendously more beneficial to dialoguing in an interview context with our Spanish speaking workers than by the phone even. We have 4 interviews that were attained virtually, whether by phone or Zoom. And we've interviewed 14 workers in person. So it speaks to the value of those in-person meetings when possible. Obviously last semester was different because of COVID, but now that those in-person venues have opened, we are taking advantage of those settings. In addition to the difference between interviews, in the moment on the farm versus at clinics. The vaccine clinics are where those 14 interviews have come from, and they were facilitated by that shared waiting space. Our interviewees had to wait 15 minutes after their vaccine anyway, and so that gave them time to consider whether they would like to participate, and if they wanted to be interviewed in the moment, to do it right then and there, rather than having to be worried about missing essential work time by cooperating with our students. So those vaccine clinics have been a very positive forum for our Spanish-speaking interviewees' participation. We've also learned at this point a few things about our interviewees' concerns, concerns that unite our Spanish-speaking interviewees, including concerns for their children and their job and visa status. And as we learn all of this about our communities and collaborate with nursing, with Leicester Church, with our farm owners and farm workers, with public history, Spanish, we've learned that this is really a rural voices project, Voces del Campo. And that's helped us to grow our project and to reframe it, to rebrand it, to take what once was documenting the undocumented and turn it into rural voices, Voces del Campo. This also makes our interviewees feel more secure in that we aren't, by the very title of our project, potentially divulging anyone's migration status. And so it becomes more inclusive and more secure for our interviewees. But I'd like to turn now to our students' takeaways, what they've learned, one of which is the challenges of technology, but even more than that, next, Cheryl, they've learned how to negotiate those technological barriers. Because yes, it can be hard when you're dealing with new technologies in the moment, and also language barriers as Spanish students at the university. And so, but we have to do that if we want to include new voices in our archives or voices that are typically underrepresented, then we have to be willing to face those challenges and put in the time necessary to overcome them and to be adaptable. And when we do, these are some of the takeaways from our students, things that we learn through this process. As future professionals, healthcare providers, and historians, we learn that people do want to tell their stories, but we have to meet them where they are and make that possible. We learn that everyone's story is unique. We tend to homogenize our rural and our Hispanic communities here in Wisconsin, and this project shows us just how diverse those communities are. And you can go next, Cheryl. It also shows us in that rich variety of stories who is here and how they contribute to our state and especially our region, Northwestern Wisconsin. Our students are picking up on how important our migrant workers, our Hispanic workers are to our community, how much a part they are of our society here. And lastly, in order for us to learn all of this, again, we've learned to be adaptable and to never assume who we are going to meet, but to let them share who they are and what they wish us to know about them with us and in their own time. And when we do that, we're all the better for it as a community. So I'll end there, and I'm happy to talk about the particularities of what we've learned in the discussion period.
Thank you so much, Dr. Casey. And I'll end with a few reflections from my students in public history. So we have this fantastic multidisciplinary project where each one of us has a role and our students have a role, and the project could never be completed without all of those pieces being together. Is that in the beginning, we knew that we had these voids in the archive. How do we get those stories that are so valuable and so necessary? The nursing faculty have built a relationship, a trusting relationship, and gathering, getting these stories from marginalized communities, trust is so very important. So we feel very fortunate that we were able to combine with nursing and have Spanish students getting experience with translation and transcription. This is an image of one of my students in public history, and this is one of her reflections. She said, I grew up in rural Wisconsin and I have a great appreciation for farm workers, but she said, I had no idea. I've lived here my whole life and I had no idea that there were Latinx immigrants that are the backbone of this industry. And so she says, this has helped me to see what I think is obvious now, that they are an important part of our communities, and it's so valuable to document their stories and others in rural areas. That she ended up interviewing farm owners and the veterinarians and so many other people. The project has continued to grow, and this is all very much a part of building a diverse archive. And I think it's so important. One of her other reflections was, I feel like I'm using my skills as a historian to do something meaningful. That the work of our students is something that, we couldn't do this without the students. And they feel very inspired to do this work. If they're not just doing an assignment to complete something, they're doing something that goes beyond them. And one of the reasons that we, at the end here, I want to close with us changing the name and making it Rural Voices or Voces del Campo, to think about beyond COVID, is that this project has spurred a really fantastic collaboration and a community project that we want to continue as an archival project, hopefully with Journal of the Plague Year, who knows, beyond, thinking about stories of migration, about culture, about history, beyond just understanding the pandemic. And we're happy, apologies if we went a little bit over time, but I think we should be fine. There was another panelist on our panel today scheduled. Denise Bates was not able to make it. So Reverend Shonda Nicole, do you want to go ahead and do your presentation next?
Absolutely will, confirming that you can hear me. And if so, I'll go ahead and share my presentation. But first, thank you all for setting the stage, both literally and figuratively, because what I'm going to do now is, I believe I'll testify. Reflections on curating stories of Black intimacy, death, and joy through the COVID-19 archive. And so I want to begin by sharing, if you will, how I situate myself. Stuart Hall suggests that no archive arises out of thin air, and also in the tradition out of which my research and methodology is situated, and that is womanism. The central organizing principle, if you will, of womanism, if it can be said that there is one, according to Phillips and McCaskill, is that it is the absolute necessity of speaking from and about one's own experiential location, and not to or about someone else's. And so as I talk about believing I'll testify, I am sharing my experience as an emerging curator of sorts, because I am not an archivist or a curator by training. I am indeed a Methodist clergywoman, a social a social enterprise founder, and one who is conducting oral histories as part of my doctoral journey in the IUPUI Arts and Humanities Institute. And so accordingly, my scholarly and methodological skills are being defined as I interrogate the archive, the COVID-19 archive, the Journal of the Plague Year archive, and the ways that my colleagues at IUPUI Arts and Humanities, we are attempting to co-curate. And so I'm looking forward to Emily sharing immediately following me, because we'll be doing building something sort of a tag team, which is also a part of the Black homiletic tradition. And so in this conversation, if you will, I am going to attempt to reflect on some of what has been published in These Stories Must Be Told, Preliminary Observations by a Black Scholar Practitioner on Silences in the Archive, that can be found in Collections, a journal for museum and archive professionals. And so, to quote Dr. Kelly Morgan, former associate curator of New Fields here in Indianapolis, from the founding of the nation's first art museums to the establishment of American art as an academic discipline, and the development of curatorial practices around American fine art museums in this country, and the collections they house have existed, as it says, as material extensions of systems founded upon genocide and slavery, maintained by various practices of marginalization, omission, and erasure. So given the vestiges of colonialism embedded within curatorial practices, I begin by asking the question, how do researchers contend with the ways their practices explicitly and implicitly reproduce silences and reinscribe colonialism? Our team there at the IUPUI Arts and Humanities Institute believes that we have, and I'm going to check the chat just to make sure that I am not missing something that I should be attentive to, as the chat is giving me some notes there. Thanks so much. So I believe that we have been intentional to be committed to critical archival practices. We meet weekly to check in with the principal researchers across the project to comb the archives for glaring silences. We intentionally employ an open access, open submission process for curatorial collections, as well as we engage in courageous conversations concerning nomenclature that privileges certain epistemological and ethical frameworks. And so the following ground, if you will, my curatorial philosophy and illumine the presuppositions that I started with as I consider curating stories of Black intimacy, death, and joy through the COVID-19 archive. And that is that, as Rodney G.S. Carter says, archives are not neutral. And so to address the non-neutrality of the archive, archivists and archival powers should be named and addressed. And when appropriate, we should leverage our powers. And that's what I attempt to do as a Black clergy woman. The majority of the curators in our area, in our current archival practices, they're phenotypically white. And the stories we are collecting actually represent those privileges, as well as we are all academics. And though I may be a scholar practitioner, there are certain biases that enter into the stories that we even pay attention to, because that is the case. To mitigate against colonizing the curatorial, researchers do well to commit to critical archival practices, as I said. And so part of womanism as a methodology and as an ideology avoids speaking on behalf of others. So let's hear first, if you will, from a young woman I interviewed there in Indianapolis, Indiana. We'll hear from her twice, Simone Murray.
There's a common saying that Blackness is not a monolith. And it's not. We look a lot of different ways. We do a lot of different things. We participate in a lot of different activities. And my goal, not just as it relates to activism, but as it relates to humanity. Hold on, Black child. As it relates to humanity, is vital. It's vital to, and I think it's historic too, right? Hopefully these photographs will last the test of time. There's a common saying that Blackness is not a monolith,
if you will. Why would I not? The mother working through a pandemic, having a conversation with a beautiful Black child, we understand from her response, a beautiful Black boy on the other side of the door, because that is part of protecting and preserving, if you will, the familial ways of intimacy that we are now being given access to because we are entering into people's homes in the midst of COVID-19. And so since Black life is not monolithic, In the brief time that I have remaining, I want to share some insights in the silences in the archive related to Black and Brown archivist experiences of intimacy in light of COVID-19. Despite the diversity of Black experiences, familial connections, both biological and those extended by virtue of neighborhood proximity, are important to most Black people and people of faith in general. Likewise, the ways that Black women care for themselves and their families during COVID-19, these have emerged as important themes in the archive. And again, let's hear from Simone Murray. Hopefully this is the second.
You know, for instance, for example, I say, you're a white man with a family. You have a wife and you've been together for quite some time. I'm a single Black woman. And that already in itself there's some differences there. I have to be with my children to do their e-learning. I don't have any help or support in that. And I can't, and because that we are so disproportionately affected by this thing called COVID-19, I have to be extra careful because again, I'm a caretaker for my mother. I have 3 children here and I'm being forced to go into a building to do work with people. There is this narrative that, you know, you can be asymptomatic and pass this virus on to somebody. So I have to be extremely careful. And a lot of the times, so safety is that's really one of my main issues, just keeping the folks that I come in contact with on a daily basis safe. And I, you know, without having proper accommodations, I've been at risk of losing my job already. I've been at risk of, you know, ministry duties that, you know, well, if you can't, are you doing this? Are you able? So, and I'm not able to, so I can't serve in certain ways because of who I have to take care of at home. And just having to be fully aware of the ramifications of this disease. It causes additional stress for sure, but I don't think you can be too safe with it.
So akin to what Dr. Anne-Marie Mingo at State College, now at Penn State College in Pennsylvania, unearthed during her oral history curation after Hurricane Katrina, the differences in intimate partner and or intimate extended family support are most important when considering the importance of intimacy as it relates to the experiences of death and dying now during COVID-19. We look shifting towards bereavement as a time of intimacy that is generally experienced and expressed in communal practices throughout the African diaspora that have been large and have been intentional and community oriented. But during COVID-19, these kinds of experiences have been disrupted. Within the archive, themes of death, dying, and differences in bereavement are emerging. Although we've not been intentional to curate them, here are 2 separate experiences, one from an activist in Indianapolis named Sarah Skipper, and then another from Reverend Teboho Klaus in South Africa. He's based just outside of Cape Town in South Africa, and I play these 2 clips back to back.
My boyfriend's uncle passed away from COVID. I have a really close friend whose mother passed away from COVID, and really my friend, when her mother passed, I was really just shocked. Like this virus really, you know, it's for anybody. And then when my boyfriend's uncle passed away, I was just like, this is really real. And you never know who you know. I mean, it may not be a direct connection, but you know somebody who knows somebody who has been affected by this. And to see, like, you know, to kind of know like the backstory, I won't put, you know, my friend's mom's business out there or whatever, but just to know the backstory of how she was treated and how my friend was treated and like the last moments that she didn't get to spend with her mom, like they text her, they didn't even call her, they text her and let her know that her mom passed away. And it's just like, I get it that we're in a pandemic and everything like that, but still, where is the morality? Where is the empathy? Where is the decency in all of this?
One of the things is the home or place of the deceased would be flooded by people showing concern. That's what would happen under normal circumstances. But this, because it has limitations of when people should come, the practice, what I saw last week was the family did not allow people to step inside the house. So they kept them inside the yard of the house. And they gathered with them there and they spoke there. And it was short visitations than normal. So it's people who just come, stop, express their solidarity with the bereaved and have to leave. Even as they come in, a register of who stepped into the yard needed to be kept, which is something so unfamiliar with people. So that
And so I don't want to close this brief exploration and testifying on reflections on curating stories of Black intimacy and death through the COVID-19 archive without sprinkling in a little bit of joy. At the IUPUI Arts and Humanities Institute, our focus is to facilitate research and education in the arts and humanities while bringing diverse voices to the table to discuss our findings. Accordingly, I have a keen interest in exploring art as an outlet. And what I noticed as I've been interrogating the archive is that while there are many instances of intimacy being disrupted by death and dying and differences of support available to different bodies, there are also beautiful expressions of how these activists, artists, people of faith are coping during COVID-19. And one such means of coping is given to us by Melita D. Carter, a spoken word artist based in Indianapolis, Indiana.
I think art plays a major part in myself being a national and international spoken word artist myself, and writing and speaking since I was 14 years old and all type of stuff. And I think that we as artists, like I'm looking at Nina Simone and Maya Angelou in front of me, you know, on my board, and just how powerful art is, you know, and how it can be used to, I guess, like, you know how they say, like, you attract more bees with honey, you know, and so it's just like being able to do something powerful, but still get your message across. I think that it is every artist's responsibility and duty to make sure that that message is coming across in their music, you know, in whatever it is, whatever kind of artistry that they're doing, because it takes art in its finest ways to be able to really bring and pull at the heartstrings of people and to have people to really understand what is going on. And art has been powerful enough to do that for centuries, you know, and so I think that art now, just seeing all of the different things that's happening, the Black Lives Matter murals and like all of the things and the artists that are coming out with their work and songs and poetry and all of that different things. And it's just so moving, you know, and it's just so necessary. And it gives people an outlet. So not even just that to tell a story, but it allows those who are being harmed or those who are learning as well to have an outlet, to have somewhere to channel. Like for me, like poetry and speaking and singing as just gives me an outlet and gives me a way of releasing the pain, whatever it is that is happening inside of me, and giving me an opportunity to release it in its purest form. And however it's received, I have nothing to do with that, you know? And so I think that art to the movement, to the lives of Black people is necessary. And I believe that every artist has a responsibility to reflect the times, as Nina Simone says once. So it's just like.
So in closing, Arundhati Roy in her acceptance lecture upon receipt of the Sydney Peace Prize stated that there's really no such thing as the voiceless. There are only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard. As we continue archiving the lived experiences of various publics throughout this COVID-19 pandemic, I hope that all archivists might intentionally attend to the personal proclivities that might awaken preferences for deliberately silencing or unhearing people whose phenotype is different than their own. Until then, I intend to seek out brown and Black people whose stories may color the archival work that I do with vibrancy, vitality, and vigor. And hopefully my efforts help to minimize the distortions, omissions, erasures, and silences that characterize archives. In the words of Grammy Award-winning Anthony Brown and Group Therapy, in their song, "Can't Nobody Tell It Like Me," can't nobody tell it like me because you don't know the story like me, because it's my testimony. Next time you peruse the archive, consider how you are being invited into someone else's story as they indeed testify. Thank you so much.
That was fantastic. Thanks so much, Shonda Nicole. That was great. Fantastic. And Emily, we are right on time. So we have time for, of course, to hear, I'm excited to hear how your projects combine.
Great. Thank you so much. I am going to share my screen as well. It's so hard following Shonda Nicole Gladden. You're so articulate. But I have also been working in this group out of the IUPUI Arts and Humanities Institute. I'd like to share my own perspective and some thoughts on the rich data set that we've collected. So we've been doing oral histories with Black and Brown activists, artists, community organizers, nonprofit staff, all working in the movement toward racial justice. But as Shonda Nicole mentioned, their experience is not monolithic. There are many different threads and activities happening inside this. If you think of the movement for racial justice as an umbrella, there are many different strands underneath it. So I want to start off with this beautiful young woman who's painting a mural on a boarded up business. This is near downtown Indianapolis. Her name is Shade Bell. She's a local artist. And the image is a sunrise over a congregation of Black people with their eyes uplifted as if they were watching God. It's a reference to Zora Neale Hurston. And one thing that I heard coming out of these oral histories is this sense of togetherness in the movement for racial justice among people of color in Indianapolis. But again, the diversity of experience that is a level underneath that. So we've talked about the COVID-19 Oral History Project and the Journal of the Plague Year that this work is a part of. One thing that's important to mention, I believe, about the COVID-19 Oral History Project is it's not only open access, but an open source project. So it's intended to be easy for anyone to create an oral history. But early on in the COVID-19 Oral History Project, so we started in March 2020, a few months in, Dr. Jason Kelly, who we work with at the IUPUI Arts and Humanities Institute, ran some numbers comparing the race and ethnicity of interviewees in interviews collected from students, by students for coursework versus research outside the classroom context. So outside of the classroom context, there was a much more diverse group of interviewees. Inside the classroom context, we had about 90% non-Hispanic white individuals, and it was a larger data set in the classroom context. So we started to be concerned that the open source nature of the COVID-19 Oral History Project was actually contributing to a silence in the archive. And as Shonda Nicole has so articulately conveyed, it's important to foreground the stories and experiences of diverse people, to archive the narratives of the racial justice movement in the hope that that archive can also become its own site of resistance. So our central questions we began to ask: how have the protests for racial justice shaped your experience during the COVID-19 pandemic? How has the pandemic shaped the protests, and have these experiences changed the way that you view the community and the nation? To date, we have completed about 20 oral histories with this particular group. They are 60 to 90-minute oral histories, and while 20 might not seem like a huge number, it's become a very rich data set. We've talked to artists, activists, community organizers, and nonprofit leaders. They are not monolithic. There are many people in this group that are all of the above or several of the above. But I think it's important to recognize that as they identify as activists or artists or nonprofit leaders, community organizers, they are speaking about the movement and about protesting in different ways. So a little bit of context about Indianapolis. It's a moderately sized city, about 16th in the country in size, according to the 2020 census. Currently has a politically moderate Democratic mayoral administration, a history of what some people have called polite protest or appeasement, moderate politics, a major reliance on private funding, not a lot of public funding for social services, and it is a highly segregated city, one of the top 10 most segregated cities in the country, according to the Brookings Institute. So all of these things become important context for the oral histories and for some of the things we'll talk about. As across the country, COVID-19 had a disproportionate impact on people of color in Indianapolis, on neighborhoods where people of color live. On the right, you can see the neighborhoods that are predominantly or majority people of color. On the left here, you can see the impact of COVID, and this is an interesting map. It actually factors in both health impacts and economic impacts at a 2-to-1 ratio of health to economic impacts, but both predominantly or disproportionately impacted people of color in the city. So as we started to interview people, it immediately became obvious that the movements in 2020 were an inflection point in struggles that went back for many generations for racial justice. So this is a young man in his late 20s speaking about generations in his family that had protested or worked for racial justice in different ways. And I wish I had the technical capacity to embed videos, but I didn't trust my capacity to do that. So I'm just going to read his quote here. He says, "It's almost crazy generationally how Black people feel toward protesting in general. My grandfather's generation, he's seen these different iterations of racism over time since he was a boy. And now you're seeing the same things, except you're getting videos of those things." His sentiment is like, yeah, burn that down. To where my dad, Black people at that point in time had achieved a status in the country to where we could go to school and it was a norm, to where we could go to work, to be able to buy a house, have however many kids and send those kids to college. Coming from that generation, it's like, okay, make it work. We've got to play the game. We got to be strategic about how we do certain things. And then you come to my generation, which is, I would say, like 40 and under, and they're like, my grandpa, it's like, burn that down. Like, no, we have the facts, we have the data, we have the videos, we have the evidence that the system is inherently racist. I do not want to sit at the table. I want to flip the table over. And then we come to the pandemic, which brings this immediate nexus of concerns. When we talked to activists about their major concerns or asked for a primary concern about the pandemic, most of them could not give one concern. They gave a long list. They talked about food and food deserts and access to food. They talked about children's concerns when they were not attending school in person, distrust of the medical establishment, and difficulties in COVID testing access, which now may also extend to vaccine access, mental health, trauma, coping, and on and on. And one way of summing it up was to say those who got lost in the cracks of the COVID response and who, just because of their existing life circumstances, have a harder time surviving. And then the police violence that we saw in 2020 happened in Indianapolis as well. It was a major spark for protests here. That started actually before George Floyd's death in early May. There was a 48-hour period where 3 people of color were killed in incidents related to police. One of them was a young man named Drejon Reed. And this quote on the left, or on the right, I'm sorry, is very compelling. We as the Black community know that this has been happening. Police brutality is not new. It is just an evolution of Klansmen, literally. And so this phone and the access to being able to put videos on the web and people can see with their own eyes what is happening has been a blessing and a curse. It's been a blessing because people have been able to see and have felt in some ways violated that this is happening and they're appalled. And then it's a curse because it's almost like the Black voice was invalid until they see the video recording. So this is a powerful history. It's a complex history. There are many layers in this narrative, layers of meaning around protest, who's protesting, who's participating, who's an ally, who's watching. I want to also speak for a moment, if that's all right, if there's time, to about the role that nonprofits have played in this space and in promoting racial justice. So I mentioned earlier that Indianapolis is a very privatized city. And I think that is perhaps one of the reasons why nonprofits have taken a leadership role, have kind of been on the front line of this fight. There's one nonprofit in particular that I'm going to speak about, although I'm not going to name it. It is an institution that funds many other nonprofits. It has a 100-year plus history, over $400 million in assets, and gives many, many grants annually. And it shifted its mission in between 2018 and 2019 from a more general mission to inspire, support, and practice philanthropy, leadership, and service in our community to a mission that more explicitly speaks about racial equity, to mobilize people, ideas, and investments to make this community a community where all individuals have equitable opportunity to reach their full potential, no matter place, race, or identity. So I spoke with a senior staff member in charge of racial equity, and she sees their work as demanding change, but from within. So in some sense, a parallel form of protest, even though it is within an institution. She says, what we've done is bring organizing into an institution and see how that works. The only way to really change the power dynamics and change the systems is to take on that type of culture. And it can look different, but the ultimate outcome of it should be that all issues that are happening in the community are confronted. So this institution, during the COVID pandemic, mobilized some emergency funds and wanted to get them directly to residents for basic needs. They got 80 to 86 cents of every dollar to basic needs. They were able to achieve that. And they did it by working with community ambassadors in 6 specific neighborhoods. These were part-time staff members on the payroll of the organization who also lived in the neighborhoods and worked in the neighborhoods, were very connected in these neighborhoods, and so had the knowledge on the ground to know what coalitions or individuals or traditional nonprofits were doing the work and being effective in an emergency situation. So because this organization had already employed these community ambassadors for a couple of years and they had built some relationships, they were able to move quickly. They also were able to listen, and they felt that they had done this with not a deficit mindset, but an understanding of what exists, and had an open mind to their communities. A few questions that I'll just leave us with that I think underlie these narratives are, what is the difference between a protester and an ally? Who is protesting? Who is an ally? Can we be both? What are the roles of professionals versus activists? Can we be doing this work together? Are they the same? Are they inherently different? If you're working inside an institution, does that inherently become a form of polite protest, or no? Is there a space for really demanding change inside an institution? Will some of these younger activists eventually transition to nonprofit work or more institutional work? And also, what does it mean that this private entity has its own independent funding and a wealth of resources so that it's been able to do this work and lay this groundwork? I want to close with a final example of a work of art from one of the people we spoke with, Israel Solomon, that is both storytelling as an act of resistance and I think speaks at a basic level to what the movement for racial justice is doing and seeing and humanizing people and saying that this is not okay. And this is a mural of George Floyd. It's for George Floyd, that is the title, showing him as a son, a Black man, and a father. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time.
That was excellent, Emily. Thank you so much. That was fantastic. And I want to know more about your project. I have questions I want to ask, but we should open it up to everybody if there's any questions. I'm not sure if there's people on Feedloop or how it's working, but I'm not seeing any questions in the chat right now.
People are encouraged to use the Q&A, and someone had, but I did answer that one because it was unrelated to the presentation.
Thank you for getting that, Shonda. I appreciate that. I didn't see it. But yeah, fun with technology on that one. But I'm curious actually. Before we'll see if anybody shows up or asks questions. But with your project, I mean, 20 interviews is a lot, right? Like Emily, you said, it may not seem like a lot. I mean, your interviews are longer. It's really interesting. We've learned a lot in terms of trust issues and cultivating a relationship with marginalized communities and allowing them to be able to share, right? Is that we have to make it as comfortable as possible for them to be able to do this. Have you had similar issues with trust in communities? Shonda, you're kind of smiling.
I'm smiling to give Emily a moment to speak because I'm able to leverage my social capital as both pastor, as activist, as someone who's been embedded in the community in different ways. I've not quite encountered those trust issues, but I'm smiling because my colleague has shared something, so I'll yield and let her speak.
Yeah, I would say that we are very fortunate that many people have been generous with their time and have opened up to us and have been willing to trust us. I think that it depends, and in a very basic way, we're just at the mercy of the individuals that they are, willing to go on the record and share their stories. I think that one of the major trust issues is not with us as individuals, but just with the willingness to put your story out there on an open access database where you don't have control over how it's going to be used. So we have had some people who have expressed concerns about that. We have, whenever people have asked, gone back and edited their oral histories out of respect for their concerns, you know, deleting sections that were concerning to them, or anything that might become a privacy violation for someone else. So yeah, I would say that we have been able to reach out to people and to build trust, but there is an obstacle there that's similar to what you all have talked about with undocumented populations, about just what does it mean to put your story out, and what is the burden of that on someone who may already have, you know, some disproportionate systems working against them.
I think, yeah, that's exactly right, is that, you know, it's so much of it is not simply just us, but it's the distrust of institutions for good reason, right? Is that all of the things that Shonda talked about too, colonization, and that's sort of built into, you know, it's built into institutions. And so the distrust is there for a reason. And particularly with us dealing with someone is undocumented, yeah, of course there, you know, that was a learning curve for us, because when I first, of course, we assumed that we would have those questions, or we would have these, you know, sensitivities to deal with. When I first started actually with Jason Kelly on the project, I mean, his data set that he found is exactly right. I remember we all had a meeting and saying, we're kind of getting the same stories, is that who is willing to share with us? And like you said, the open access part of it is who is going online and feeling comfortable enough to record something, or who is saying yes to the interviews, or, you know, my students were seeing a lot of that, who is reaching out to us to say, I want my story, please record me, versus really trying intentionally to talk to Indigenous communities. And we've been actually, Lorraine has given me, she has some connections with Indigenous communities in South Dakota, and Lisa has connections with the Ho-Chunk Nation and Menominee Nation. So we've been trying to get those too. And so it's like, we had to be very intentional about that. You know, I mean, it's very obvious in retrospect. Of course, it's you know, it's not me that they might not trust. It's also the institution. And what are you going to do with this? Where is it going to go?
And the students, oh, sorry, no, go ahead.
No, please. I've spoken quite a bit.
Oh, so wait a minute, since Dr. Jimenez-Frye was just talking for our project, I'll cede to you.
Well, I was going to reference the question that came through in the Q&A because it does speak a little bit to this, and that is about models of ownership and donation. And so for our project, we of course have a deed of gift and informed consent that takes into consideration the non-commercial share alike license, as well as we have a separate license, I think, that is for all of our projects, that COVID-19 JOP. And that is that the interviews become public. They are available to researchers and to individuals, though they are housed in the university library systems at our respective institutions and in the archives that we are indeed curating. They are accessible pretty much to anyone. And that has been the only major hesitancy that I've experienced in the collection, and that is with people connected to institutions. They're not sure what's going to happen to them, especially in Indianapolis. As Emily has noted, it is highly segregated. And so some of these things to be used against others when they think about employment. We've interviewed people who are employed by some of these to not be named institutions that we have experienced. We have seen in the news most recently that there's been some actions that have been somewhat nefarious to those who are employed by institutions when they take a stance in a way that seems to be contrary to what is in the best interest of the institution. So that's the hesitancy that we've experienced, but it's public.
Yeah, with ours, I will say just real quick, because I know Elena, you probably have you know, more to add on this too, but to also tag on to Shonda's response and to answer Denise in the Q&A is that you know, we have had hesitancy, but one of the things, we do have the same informed consent that you all are using, Journal of the Plague Year, it's across the board. We have the same, yeah, these are, the intention is to make this open access. We have them in our archive here, but they're shared. Our content is shared with Journal of the Plague Year, and they're also at Indiana, Purdue, it's in those archives. So the idea is, the more open access, the better, right? We're public historians. But I understand the hesitancy from participants, and our participants in particular, almost always, Elena can probably talk more about this, but almost always choose the option to keep the interview embargoed for 3 years. That on our informed consent, it says, when does this remain? When does this go? When is this available to the public? Immediately, a year from now, or 3 years from now. And I think almost always they want to be anonymous, and they want it to be embargoed for 3 years.
Exactly. And that was actually one point I was going to make, that our students have observed as student interviewers, that they were, from their own backgrounds, surprised at how thoroughly our interviewees wanted to read through those consents and understand them. And that's also part of why doing interviews at these vaccine clinics with built-in wait time is so important, because it gives time and space for someone interested to sit down and read that document fully before they make a decision about our project. And we've actually also had to, train our students in interpreting those consents and the different options that our interviewees have. And I know Dr. Jimenez-Frey, you can speak to the 2 consent options we have for just how widely their interviews are shared and how much they can be edited by outside organizations. That also is important. And yes, many if not all do want a 3-year embargo on their interviews being shared. So those consent forms, those printed consent forms too, being able to take a copy with them home are incredibly important. And Dr. Jimenez-Frey, do you want to recap really quickly the 2 different
they're exactly
options
the
they
same
have?
that
Or
everybody else has. There's
okay,
the Creative Commons license, and then there is the Indiana, Purdue, and Journal of the Plague Year, and our project. So they're both the same licensing agreements there, but it's very clear. I mean, the informed consents, that's the thing, is that it's not like someone's not reading the Apple, like, I agree to sign my life away or whatever. Like, our participants are reading all of those things and saying, what exactly are you doing with this? And it seems like, once they do that, they are willing to share their stories. They are excited to share their stories. They are glad that someone cares, but they need to feel safe enough to be able to do it. Yeah, Lisa, I know you wanted to add something, and there's another piece in the Q&A.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that the way the dairy workforce works is very different than like migrant workers in vegetables and things. And the reason that 3-year option is often picked is, I would say, most often our dairy workers are there for about 2 or 3 years, go home for 2 or 3 years, and then often come back. So I think that's kind of what the background is with that.
Yeah, why they say, release this within 3 years, and for understandable reasons too, right? That they feel particularly vulnerable, given the political situation for the last 4 years. That was even more heightened. There were issues. I remember that, in this fall, I think we had more issues, maybe because of the political context, but after the election, I remember, Dr. Casey, we had a conversation, is that maybe people would be more comfortable talking to us after the election. We didn't know, like, all of that sort of played into it. And it was, we had anticipated these questions coming into the project, because my students doing interviews in public history classes, they had no problem with the people that they were asking. In terms of Emily, the data set, it showed exactly who they were asking, right? Is who they were comfortable with. They didn't want to go outside of their comfort zones. And that quite often meant white middle class communities, the perspectives. And those people, those participants, their experiences obviously matter, but they had no problem being on Zoom and being recorded and signing the informed consent. And there were so many things that we had to build in for the undocumented workers project that was a learning process. With these projects like this, like with rapid response collections, you're building it as you go. There were a couple other questions. Do you have resources or teaching organizations you recommend for archivists? I would say, Claire, actually, the Journal of the Plague Year has a whole set of teaching modules, which are fantastic. So if you go onto, they're a little bit, I think, harder to find, but I know that they were trying to make it easier to find them on the Journal of the Plague Year site. but there's a little search tool and you can search for teaching modules. If I can, I'll try to find it here in the time we have left and I can put it in the chat, but there are all sorts of, a group of scholars working on the Plague Year project put together readings on archival silences, on, interview questions. I mean, our students had to learn pretty quickly, how to ask a good interview question. You don't ask a yes or no question. You ask open-ended. You allow the participant to talk. I mean, so those are really good. Yeah, you're welcome, Claire. Joan said, do the communities have a role in deciding the ownership? They may not want the interview to be available publicly, but only within the community. That's not quite in the informed consent. And maybe Shonda, I don't know if you could speak to this better than I could on the legalese there, but I don't think that's an option, is that there's two options. There's a Creative
Commons, non-share alike.
And that's just really open. It's like, it doesn't have, it's really open. And then there's a second option where it's only the partners that are on the Journal of the Plague Year that are listed on that have access to edit it, to do things to but it's open access to the public. So yeah, we don't have the ability to alter the informed consents and say it would only be available to a certain community. I think that would particularly help with certain populations, but it would be difficult to get around, I think, with the informed consents.
I wanted to add as a resource for oral histories that we've encountered, especially for virtual oral histories that are better performed by phone, Google Voice as a free recording technology to be incredibly helpful in our pursuit of phone interviews over Zoom or Collaborate Ultra. So if anyone's looking for that technology, I'd recommend it.
Yeah, I don't know if Shonda or Emily, if you ran into the issue of people not wanting to be on Zoom. I don't want my face, but I'm more than happy to tell my story. And then, so we had to think about what is a free software, because the project, it's not like we have endless budgets, right? We are in the humanities. So to say, how do we record these as a free technology? Actually, Google Voice has worked really well for us.
We've used the Voice Recorder Pro.
Okay.
Because it's been helpful to just get it on an iPhone. When back in the day when we were still hanging out in the streets doing these kinds of oral histories, but it also does well over phone, on a phone conversation. But I was curious, and I would hope that you all will be able to speak to it. Are you finding that when it comes to transcribing your oral histories, that any particular platform works better than others, as we think of the kind of the dictatory nature, the vernacular of non-native English speakers, or those who may speak Ebonics or African-American language, etc. How have you worked through those transcription challenges, or have you encountered them?
Well, that's a question that actually Dr. Casey and I are working on, is that transcription software that recognizes Spanish. Is that in English, my students have used Otter AI and it works just fine. Obviously, it's a machine and so it's flawed, and so they have to go through and clean things up. But Elena, you can probably speak to this more, because we were just talking about this the other day.
And I will say we are at the beginning of this process. So now that we have around 20 interviews, we are beginning to assign several of our student interns to begin transcription while others are still performing interviews. So this is very much an ongoing question for us as well. Right now, we found that Kaltura has a technology that can integrate with platforms like Canvas, does transcribe native Spanish speakers' voices fairly accurately. So it can pick up on our Spanish speaking interviewees well. However, that's a video recording platform. And something we've also noticed is that it doesn't pick up as well on what some of our interviewers who are native English speakers are saying in Spanish. It doesn't register the transcriptions as accurately. But that's only we only have one in Spanish, one video interview. And so we are still looking for ideal technologies for transcription for audio interviews beyond something like Kaltura or YouTube.
There are a few that we looked up, but we honestly haven't tried them yet. So yeah, very much work in progress, but that's very much a question, right? Is that, speaking of we were kind of shocked that Otter AI is such a big software and it doesn't recognize anything but English.
And not even that well, depending upon the diction of the speaker.
Yeah, so that's a really pretty big glaring hole that, I mean, and you know, all of you know, like, or you know, that transcription can take forever. I mean, it's a process.
Yeah. And beyond the technologies, you know, another question we have is, okay, some of our, I mean, these are our interviewers are students, and some of them are not native Spanish speakers. And so they're sometimes in their questions, they may commit grammatical errors. And so there's a question of, you know, how do we want to transcribe their language? How much do we correct, and how do we demonstrate if we have altered what they have said? And so, yeah, these are questions that we're working through. And if anyone is already in the transcription process, I would love to hear kind of how you've worked through them as well.
Well, and we, you know, I mean, with Spanish to English, you know, you're translating emotions too, right? Or like slang, and it's not putting something in Google Translate, obviously, and then. And in the summer, we're actually, our project is in part funded by the Albert LePage Center at Villanova University, and they are. We have an intern actually from Villanova that's going to be working with us in the summer, which is fantastic because she is a native Spanish speaker from Argentina. So that will be a big help. Is that for if we can't get these transcripts, if we can't find a software that actually is able to read it. That may be something that we just have to have a native Spanish speaker do it in, you know, over the summer, which is time consuming, but important work, right? Yeah, I'm really, I love your project though. I love that it sounds like you already have like a sort of robust data set that's coming. Like we are sort of more we're still in the mode of gathering. We haven't analyzed yet. It sounds like with your project, you're analyzing some of your findings, right? Like this is what we're seeing. Yeah.
Starting to, yes. Yeah, we are working toward a virtual exhibition called Place, Power, Pandemic, and Protest. So that has given us, I guess, an endpoint to shoot toward. We're hoping to do that in the summer. So trying to wrap up our oral histories this spring and then pull in related data in order to put that together.
That's very cool. It would be fun to do another panel next year to check in on the project, because that's like the nature of rapid response collections is you're just kind of, you're collecting history as it's happening. And, you know, in the beginning, it's like, give me everything. I want all of it. I need to collect it. And then you need to analyze it, right? What does this actually tell us? So it would be really cool to do a follow-up in the year.
Yeah, I think I'm game to do a follow-up in a year.
I agree.
I would love it. I think it would be really excellent. We're trying to, I mean, that would be on the goal list for us too, is to do a digital exhibit to show, you know, particularly because the Latinx community is so absent in most people's minds. They just don't think of it when they think of the rural Midwest. So
yeah, I mean, I even, just as a quick anecdote, I had an interview recently with a news agency, and the reporter in the process kept trying to say, oh, you know, Wisconsin's like, we're so white, like, you know, why would you look at this population? And like, well, actually, and so I guess a question I also had for all of you, or for anyone that's had experience asking about how people feel about governmental responses to the pandemic is, you know, if you've asked that question, how have you asked it? Have you noticed if your interviewees are responding? It's a question on our project that to this point, no one has wanted to answer. And it's something that, you know, if we can get to the point where our interviewees want to share that information, we would certainly want to hear what they think. So does anyone have experience with that or any ideas for approaching this?
Well, we definitely ask, how has your municipal or civic leadership responded to the pandemic, and how do you feel about their responses? I'm thinking of an interview that I did with a pastor based in Dallas, Texas at the very beginning of the pandemic, who had some very strong, and I think, Emily, you were in on that one too. It had some very strong thoughts around government non-response. And I would love to have interviewed him most recently with the recent fallout after the major snowstorm and the breakdown in infrastructure, because people are not shy in talking about failures of their government. But then on the other side, there are some who are also not shy and applauding government leaders and legislators who have been out in the streets with them in protests over the summer in Indianapolis. So, but we do ask.
I would love to, I'm just like, my wheels are turning, is that because we live so close to Minneapolis, and that, George Floyd was obviously a big deal everywhere. It should have been, right? And so there was a strong movement here in Eau Claire too, amongst, protest movement after the killing of George Floyd. So I'm wondering if this could be a collaboration in the future, is that my students are working with you guys to reach out to the activist community there, or it can be if I can have students contributing to the plague year, the COVID-19 stories of activists in Indianapolis, but thinking about Minneapolis too.
Absolutely. New City Church in Minneapolis immediately comes to mind. Reverend Tyler Sitt is doing great work out there. And then there's also in, I can't think of the name, but it's another M, Mosaic, and someone I did seminary with, and that is Jared Morey and his wife, Rachel, reverends, both of them.
If you don't mind, do you mind sending me a couple, maybe just a little blurb about contacting them? I mean, I would love
If
to.
you will initiate it, absolutely.
I would love that. I would absolutely, because again, it's the question of trust, right? Is that you need an in the community, and that's what, Lorraine and Lisa were able to say, hey, actually, we're already in there and they trust us, we help them. And so if you could introduce me, I would love to have, I have graduate students working with me on the project too. I would love to have graduate students interviewing activists in Minneapolis about, and it could, we're all part of the Plague Year Project, right? So all of these things will be going to the same place.
Absolutely.
I just wanted to share one comment last spring that one of the community members from the Indian reservation we usually had went to in South Dakota, when the student asked the community member about how has COVID-19 affected your community, they were very surprised when the community member said, there's less people were wearing masks, but it really hasn't affected anything because everything we have here on the reservation is a necessity. So they were all frontline workers. We only have the hospital, the gas station where we get our food, the Tree of Life where we get our clothing, secondhand. We don't have hair salons, nail salons, restaurants that are closed. So as far as businesses go, they have limited hours, but nothing is totally closed down because we don't have anything extra. And I think students were very taken aback when they looked around at the things they missed. Movie theaters, getting my nails done, got to get my hair cut. And when they looked at the other community and saw that they didn't have anything, it just was like, oh. So I think those are the voices. And so when you ask sometimes, how has it affected you? And you want to know that, they're kind of surprised because they're like, you really care? It really hasn't changed how we do things, although culturally not getting together in groups has been very, has impacted them. So I think part of it is a surprise that people want to hear their story on the reservation. So our other member of our group probably would have brought those stories alive today had she not had that, family emergency. But I think that it'll be really interesting to hear those voices as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to say real quick before Denise leaves, Denise in the chat said, thank you so much for a great panel. Thank you for listening. Thank you for allowing us to share this space. Thank all of you for sharing these stories. This has been really great. I mean, it's really inspiring for me. I'm sure it is for Elena and Lisa and Lorraine too, to see the other work that's going on, like that our projects are linked in so many ways that we're attempting to do the same thing. We're working on archival silences. So it gives me more inspiration to continue with the project that we're doing. So thanks.
Yes, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you all. I have another commitment, and so I don't know if you all will stay on, but I bid you all adieu, and I'll see you next time.
Yeah, let's stay in touch.
Thank
I
you
think
for your
for a
work.
year catch up, right? Let's do a panel next year.
Yes, please.
That's great. Nice to meet you too, Emily.
Bye.